So again, way iskot Leyton. I'm joining you from Syilx, Okanagan territory, where I'm a settler guest. The Syilx Nation, to this day and every day forward, the rightful caretaker of this territory that I get to live and work and research on. And it's my obligation to acknowledge and to respect and to learn from the Syilx and their knowledge and their language, but also from their ongoing relationship to the land and the natural world. The Syilx have taken care of these homelands for thousands of years, and now that I call this place home, it's really my responsibility to engage with the land, with the nation, in ways to learn and grow, so that I too can be a steward of this land and this place. And on the slide are just some wonderful opportunities I've had to partner with the Penticton Indian Band over the last few years. In particular, that bottom left-hand corner is the floodplain re-engagement site, which is a Syilx-led project supporting symbiotic relationships of extinct or almost extinct animals and plants. And so today, I'm so looking forward to learning with you all. And on the next slide coming up, you will see that we're partnering with several groups to do this work: the Indigenous Math Network, the David Robitaille International STEM Education Network that Cynthia leads, Dogwood 25, which is a non-for-profit organization working to support and mentor teachers. We have some support from the BC Ministry of Education and the Rural Education Advisory. Thank you everyone for joining us. And if you feel like you have something you'd like to share in the chat box that self-locates yourself in relationship to the territory, the land, we welcome you to do so at this time. And now I'll pass the torch to Cynthia, who I believe will introduce the team presenting today.
Right. Thank you, Leyton, and welcome everybody. My name is Cynthia, and I'm a professor in the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy at UBC. And I hold the chair for the David Robitaille Professorship in Mathematics and Science Education. And I'm also a member, as well as the rest of our team, of the Indigenous Math Education Network that's helping to facilitate our session today. So it's a pleasure to be co-hosting this series on culturally responsive math assessment. And as Leyton mentioned, and Janice, please feel free to put in the chat, where you are currently located on the lands that you're coming from, and let us know who you are. I'm currently on the traditional unceded territories of the Hunkaminam speaking people in the lower mainland of Vancouver. As UBC is on the traditional unceded lands of the Musqueam. So I'm honored to introduce my colleagues who are co-hosting and here with us, facilitating this session. There's Joanne Archibald, Kwang Kwang Liam, Janice Novakowski, they're good, waving, good. Stephanie LaFrance, also everybody here is from UBC, and you've already met Leyton, also from UBC. And of course, I also want to introduce to you Kaganjad, who in the Haida language is mouse woman. And Kaganjad is a supernatural shapeshifter who works to try to restore beauty and balance and equity. And this design is done by Billy Yovanovich, who says that Kaganjad is kind of sneaks up on you, just like math does, comes in to try to lend a helping hand, to try to help solve a problem. So Kaganjad is always there, always helping, just as most women would. So here, again, is back to our poster for the series. This is the third in a series of 3. And as Leyton mentioned, our guiding question is around thinking about culturally responsive math assessment. And we've been drawing upon the land and place, as well as story, to try to help us think about what is culturally responsive math assessment. And how can we be guided by the teachings of the land and culture, as well as the principles of story work. So we are going to just kind of give a little bit of a recap to session 1 and session 2, just like if you're watching a Netflix series, you always get that little recap beforehand, especially for those who are joining us in session 3 who were unable to attend either session 1 or 2. So we'll just introduce 3 further principles of Indigenous story work. They are synergy, holism, and interrelatedness that will, guide us in thinking more about and enacting culturally responsive math assessment. And we'll focus also on sharing some more examples and resources to help all of us begin to think more about this exciting work. And just to recognize too that we're all kind of working together and thinking about this. So these are new ideas that we're just trying to conceptualize together. So we talked in our last session a little bit about learning from the land and thinking about the earth and land as teacher for thinking about culturally responsive math assessment. And we drew a little bit upon or talked about Dr. Suzanne Simard's work, and also Robert Maud Kimmerer's work in thinking about the moss and the land and the trees and the interconnectedness of the mycelium that are beneath the soil, and how there's really a kind of a challenge to this colonial perspective that is seen in competition, where trees are maybe competing with one another for the light and the nutrients, and instead sort of thinking more about this interconnectedness, like moss, which forms kind of like a colony of being able to help each other, where they're kind of stronger together, and using a practice of this kind of communication of land and earth to help us think and rethink or restory our own ideas of thinking about connections and relationships, and how we might use those to think about assessment. So assessment that isn't so individually marked and ranked, but assessment that is more collaborative, co-constructed, being able to work with our students and their families and community. These are some of the resources we spoke about in our last session that you can also find in our Padlet, which I'll give you the link to in just a sec. And we also talked a little bit about some of these examples of thinking about land and place as a place to explore mathematics. And we gave some examples of looking at patterns outdoors. And then this example of thinking about fractions. And instead of starting with fractions in a textbook, instead starting by thinking about where are fractions and the multiplication of fractions in students' lived experiences. Where might we see that? So for example, even thinking about in the Cug and Jad Mouse Woman design of Billy Ivanovich, maybe Billy started with a smaller design and then proportionally grew that design. So this thinking about where fractions might be in our everyday practices. So that is a bit of a recap around those principles. I'm just going to pass it now to Joanne to just give us a bit of a recap on the principles of Indigenous Storywork that we talked about last time. Joanne.
Great. Iswayal, everyone. Good day. I join you from the unceded traditional lands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in the Vancouver area. And we have worked a little bit with these 7 Indigenous Storywork principles that you see on this slide. And we focused on reverence and reciprocity in session 1, and then respect and responsibility in session 2. So I'll talk about our session 2 with respect, that we try and open ourselves, use our multiple senses for listening, observing, experiencing, and that requires some patience. And when we talked about these principles in the last session, we were helped by 2 stories. One, a traditional story about Old Man Coyote searching for the bone needle. And I won't retell the story. You can listen to the recording of session 2 to get the story. But for those who participated in the last session, Coyote had lost that bone needle and was looking for it, going around and around a very bright fire in the nighttime. And Owl, a friend, decided to help him, and found through her questioning of Old Man Coyote that the bone needle wasn't around the fire, but that's what he kept doing. He was comfortable going around that fire. So maybe Old Man Coyote needed to then start to think about, if we're moving to culturally responsive math assessment, going to some other way of doing that kind of math assessment that might be more relevant, appropriate to students. And with that, having Owl there to help Coyote, it was a way that she took both respect and responsibility. She, had a challenge to think about how can she help Coyote go look for that bone needle. The story ended at that point. It doesn't mean it was an end. I mean, it stopped at that point, but the story can continue. So thinking about how that owl could kind of help Coyote be open to learning and considering different forms of assessment to maybe draw on what Coyote might be interested in, and then both then taking on that responsibility to learn in a way about how they might develop relationships with others who could help them, or to think about how colonization has shaped their and our perspectives about indigeneity, indigenous ways of knowing and being. And also, Janice told a personal experience story about her son and ways that he had different ways of learning and also showing what he learned, but it was the teachers and also the advocacy of Janice to have teachers expand their forms of assessment to be more, take on that responsibility to ensure that Janice's son had opportunities to demonstrate his forms of learning, and then working with the family at that point to do that. So those were, just a quick recap of those two principles and how those two stories helped us think about these principles.
Thanks, Joanne. So we took what we learned, or what we, the stories that Joanne had just mentioned, and asked you to post your own stories of respect and responsibility to the Padlet. And here is a screenshot of our Padlet, and there's the QR code there. I think Janice will probably put in the chat the actual link to the Padlet if you want to go there that way. But here people are posting their stories of respect and responsibility from session 2, and from session 1, reverence and reciprocity. So just looking at the posts from last week, we can see here that there are some highlights here of how people are talking about respect in terms of reading the signs with more than just our eyes and ears, being able to read our students in different ways, and thinking about listening in terms of raising awareness of our own valued interpretations to put a better understanding of the assumptions and the biases that we come with, and calling that respectful listening. And then another post was around respect, was around increasing their own mathematical awareness. So spending some time working with mathematics in order to be able to see, my understanding of it was to see mathematics in places you might not see. And in order to do that, you needed to be able to learn more mathematics yourself. And those are some highlights from the posts on respect, and some highlights on the posts from responsibility, focusing on there's another interesting story, beautiful story about Coyote and Creator, and then talking about how it's important to help students notice what they have and what they bring with them to the classroom, all the strengths and gifts that they have and bring with them. And then also thinking about our own responsibility as teachers around how math assessment might bring us closer together as families and communities, and the role of assessment in that. I think that stems nicely from our connections to thinking about earth and land, and how just as a nature and the earth nurtures relationships, how might we do that also with assessment? So you're certainly welcome to add any of your own thoughts related to respect and responsibility if you haven't already. And you can certainly do it later too. Okay, over to Joanne.
Cynthia,
Yeah,
it's Janice. I'm just going to interrupt you because there's some comments, and I'm noticing it as well, that the right side of the slide is cropped a little bit in the present mode that you have it in. And I've tried the different view options and it stays a little bit.
Okay. Oh, is that better?
Now it is. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. It was over. I didn't even know. I'm looking at the little screen. Thank you for mentioning that. Okay. All right. So now, Joanne, it will be, sorry, now I have to, sorry, I'm going to have to just move this over so I can advance the slides. Where'd the, okay, there we go. There. Okay. And here.
Okay. Okay, so Cynthia, I'm going to tell a story. So you could just stay on this slide until I'm ready to go to the next slide. So today I want to share some thoughts about the remaining 3 principles of holism, interrelatedness, and synergy. And as I was thinking about these principles, a story seemed to emerge in this space that may help us think about these principles and also connect them somewhat to culturally responsive math assessment. And the story I'm going to tell is from Elder by Hilbert of the Upper Skagit people around the Seattle area and along the West Coast, Coast Salish peoples, and just south of the border, which wasn't the border long ago. We have some similar traditions, and part of our stories, there are animals and birds that can become a teacher for us in these stories. And sometimes the smallest, most insignificant kind of creature, becomes an important character in our stories. And often the characters might take on kind of human characteristics. So we might be able to identify in some ways with these characters in the story. So with Vi Hilbert's story, it's a short one. So I just want you to take some time to relax, have a bit of fun with your imagination. I know many of you had a really busy day. So, just kind of have a relax, don't take notes, and enjoy this, being with this particular story. And the character in this story is called Lady Louse. Now, one day, Lady Louse in her community walks into her great big longhouse. And as she enters the longhouse, she thinks about, in the past, her community had many cultural gatherings. Some may call them potlatches, others may call them feasts, but it was opportunities for the families and communities and neighboring communities and nations to get together. An opportunity to share food, song, dances, to share knowledge, to talk about the cultural laws and the teachings. So it was an important gathering for many different purposes. But as she looked around that longhouse, she feels rather sad. And the more she looks at the longhouse, the sadder she gets, because she then realizes that longhouse has not been used for many years and it hasn't been taken care of. There's lots of garbage around and lots of dust all over. And she thinks that maybe it's time to bring back all those gatherings in that longhouse and in that community. And then she wonders, what should she do? How should she do it? So much to do. And then she has an idea that maybe she's got to clean up the longhouse first. So she finds her little cedar broom, goes to one end of the longhouse where there are some wooden benches, and she starts to sweep away with her little cedar broom because there's so much dust, and the dust starts to rise a little bit, and then she works faster and faster because she realizes there's just so much work to do. She's brushing very, very fast, and then there's so much dust that when Lady Louse gets to the middle of the longhouse, she's lost. So that was Vi Hilbert's story that ended suddenly, or stopped suddenly, I should say, but wasn't really the end of the story. But when it stops, that story stops. It's kind of an invitation for those who are listening to engage with the story in some way. And so when I think about these principles of holism, interrelatedness, and synergy, I want to share an idea or two about those principles and in relation to culturally responsive math assessment. So let's go to the next slide, please. You know, this principle of holism, to think about, you know, a whole way of educating, you know, the parts of our human development, our intellectual, emotional, physical, and spiritual. And with that is also the context in which the student or oneself is located within family, community, the nation, the wider society. And, you know, when I think of Lady Louse, you know, wanting to you know, bring back, we could say, revitalize the cultural gatherings and within that longhouse, you know, I think it is a way to think of holism in that these cultural gatherings, you know, were and actually still are ways when people gather, they can learn. They can learn about history, about kinship. They can learn songs and dances and maybe be reminded about teachings and various cultural philosophies and traditions. And you know, with that, there are ways to renew kinship or establish relationships. And so I think Lady Louse was thinking that, you know, that those gatherings were in a way, a holistic way to be together. So if we take that idea, then trying to connect it to culturally responsive math assessment, then we must think about how can I, as an educator, design the assessment to reflect ways of knowing, of feeling, of doing action, and of being. You know, that being is how we feel about ourselves, our identity as an individual, as a student in that classroom, and in our teaching of including Indigenous ways of knowing and being, how we might connect that assessment to that pedagogy. And that, so if we think about that longhouse, you know, and if the students were learning about the importance of the longhouse as a place of learning, of socialization, of gathering, you know, they could learn about that. But then we think, how might we assess what they're learning, and then also ensure that mathematics education is a part of that holistic, place-based experience. And along with that, you know, that Lady Louse kind of was working by herself, and she didn't really include her family or her community in thinking about how to move forward with revitalizing the cultural gatherings and that. So maybe there's a reminder to think about what are ways of knowing that are within the community that can be used, that can be drawn on to help with both the pedagogy and the assessment. The next one, please. So when we think of the principle of interrelatedness, and with this, it's giving some opportunity to develop, to think about relationships and connections to people, to more than humans, to our environment, to nature. And to the more than humans, I can go back to our stories. The old man coyote in session 2. Wow, that's a character, a more than human kind of character that, can help us learn, to help us question. The little lady louse, another one. Kunganjad, another one. So, the more than humans in Indigenous stories, can help us make connections that then would relate to ways we bring math, community, and culture together. And so if we think about the assessment practice, then, we can ask ourselves, in my particular culturally responsive math assessment, how can I include ways to develop relationships and connections to people more than humans and the environment? And along with that, for indigeneity, it is important that we as educators also develop critical understandings about the impacts of colonial laws and policies on Indigenous students. That dust could be a symbolism of the impact of colonization, the laws and policies that, had the goal of obliterating Indigenous ways of knowing, many ways of Indigenous life. And that, so we have to understand those impacts, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge the resilience and resistance of Indigenous peoples to colonization, that today we are fortunate that we have some of our languages, we have some of our stories, we have some of our teachings, and we're, working to revitalize those particular forms of knowing and being. And, with that story, with the dust, eventually, dust settles. So when it settles, then we have a kind of a new opportunity to see, to be, to do in the world. So we'll go to the next slide then. For synergy, that, then, and I draw on a teaching from the late elder Ellen White Kawassalit from Nanaimo area, and she was a wonderful storyteller, but she often talked about the importance of energy. It's when we, we can create new things out of existing energy if we act on it, that, there's a way to create the new ideas or reinforce or strengthen some of our ideas. And if we do that through sharing, critical reflection, and experiential learning, then we can create something that, I think for culturally responsive math assessment could be quite exciting. If we draw on student synergistic understandings, the vitality that students have when they get excited about learning and about telling and sharing what they're learning, through multimodal opportunities. So we have to think, does our math assessment make space and honor, the students' understandings, so that the assessment does match the understandings? It's not that we're trying to fit, the students must particularly understand a particular thing in a particular way there. So I think that is a way that we might think of those three principles. And I've related it a little bit to the Lady Louse story, and how we might connect it to math assessment. And perhaps we could have a little bit of time. I think we do have some time here for anyone in this webinar to share some thoughts about how you might approach culturally responsive math assessment with one of these three principles. Think of what you're doing now, or what you might do in your math teaching, and think about how you might draw on one of the principles and also connect it to a way you would assess learning. So if we could, see what ideas are in the chat, or if we could have, someone unmute and share their thoughts. Let's just open up, as we say, we'll open up the floor here. And I think there's a comment from Ian mentioning a book, a resource, looking at the history of maths.
I'm happy to talk a little bit about it. It was introduced to me by a mathematician out east, former teacher on Twitter. He's at Math Garden, and he introduced the book to me, and it's just the nice peeling back of the veil into a lot of the unspoken or uncurriculared math that has gone on worldwide, and open up some of those discussions, which is permeated nicely into an asynchronous Math 11 class that we're doing in our district, History of Mathematics, whereas I like to sell it, the more important part about mathematics, talking about the story of math, not solving those stupid algorithms that are always frustrating. And it's amazing to see how that pathway really connects with a couple kids who find the problem solving very stressful, and really enjoy unpacking, and much like this journey has been, looking at the holistic part of mathematics and how the story of math is more important than what the times tables are.
Mm-hmm. Great. And how would you link that, an assessment idea then, using that particular resource in the way that you are?
Well, that's again the nice part, and the synergy that it builds is that it becomes a holistic evaluation process, because all the questions that are generated through the curriculum come out through a portfolio. So the student's responsible for almost creating like a blanket of the different discoveries, the different thoughts, the conversations, and sometimes summations, sometimes bigger projects that all come together in a big mash, and then it becomes a co-evaluation to figure out how does that translate into the required percentage in order to earn the credit. And it becomes a discussion about what, and what I like about it, what did you already know before you entered into the discussing about this, and what did you authentically learn? What didn't you know when you started that you know now? So that leads to lots of good discussions about, do we value a person's schema and what they already knew before they took a course, or do we value how much more they knew at the end of the course? Great.
Thank you, Ian. Wonderful. Anyone else want to share a thought? Any ideas that come from that story, Lady Louse? Don't worry if not. Leyton, do you want to say a bit more about what you've put in the chat?
Shay and I get to work with a wonderful colleague in Prince George, with different kinds of circles. And one of the circles I've been doing in math has been knowledge building. So everyone shares what they understand about something, or what they've been learning about something. And so instead of assessing individuals, it's like collectively we build on it. Everybody shares something they understand about this thing that we've been exploring together. And that's been really powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a nice example about the power of synergy. Denise, you talked about assessing students' understanding from their chosen ways of demonstrating their learning to the classroom and math community. Can you tell us a little more?
Well, as the students are demonstrating their previous or gained understandings of any concept, strategy, how they've chosen to do something, I just use that is my assessment of that student at that moment of time. That helps me make my decisions moving forward. But I also find that if you bring it to the whole math community, then everyone is learning from that student and valuing what they are doing. And that student and sharing their understanding is moving several students forward at that time who are ready to be occupying the same learning space with that student. And that just takes away so much pressure. It's just a constant circle. Show me what you know, share what you know, learn from what someone else knows, and I can take care of my obligations of moving you forward and sharing with your family what it is that you have learned and what you are able to do.
Great. Must be sounds like a very engaging and exciting time when that happens, Denise.
It is for sure. And it just empowers kids and teacher candidates to want to share what they've been making sense of and what they can now apply to their previous learning in their life. It's very exciting.
Great, thank you. Well, shall we move on then, Cynthia?
Yeah, Janice, I'd like to invite you to talk about our design template that we've been working on.
Great, thank you. So this has just been posted on the Padlet just recently. So if you haven't been to the Padlet for a while, it's on the far right side. And we thought this might be helpful to you. It's very small font on the screen. We recognize that. It looks like this when you print it off on just a regular letter size page of paper. But what I would do would be enlarge it to 11 by 17 to sit down with someone to co-plan drawing upon the 7 principles of Indigenous storywork. And there's some prompts included in there on that template to prompt your thinking as you design a unit of study in mathematics to make those sort of connections to the principles. Again, you could also download it as a PDF and then add to it on your computer, so digitally. So the questions on the right-hand side, the 7 principles are on the right-hand side of the template. And there's 2 prompting questions or provocations for each principle that are drawn from Joanne's slides over the 3 sessions. So those are the questions that she has offered to us to help us think more deeply about those 7 principles. And so those are included there. And then the image of the Storywork principles, again, at the top is from her website, and the website address is also there on the template. So in the first box, and I'll just read it aloud, as we think about, anticipate, and design for mathematics learning experiences with our students, we can become Storywork ready by engaging with the 7 Indigenous Storywork principles to guide our practices and our thinking about culturally responsive math assessment. What principles will you draw upon for this unit of study and why? And to me, that's, again, hopefully you're doing this in collaboration with a teacher that you're planning with, or a resource teacher, or students or family members in community some way, so that you're having those really important discussions in terms of what connections you might make to specific principles and why you might choose to focus on them. So that's the principles that you're going to draw upon. And then the second box is really the practices that you're going to enact that are connected to the principles that you're thinking about. And so, for example, if you're thinking about something like synergy, as an example, and building on Leyton's example of the knowledge building circles, you might say, okay, let's try that. That's something we haven't tried before. Let's do a knowledge building circle. Or if you're thinking about something I'm just trying to look at some of these examples here in terms of respect. How are we honoring children's different ways of knowing and being? What different choices are we going to offer students for assessment in this mathematics unit of study? And we've designed this so that it's kindergarten through grade 12, but could also go beyond that. And that we're thinking of our unit of study and what different assessment opportunities we can include. I'm just noticing that there's a whole bunch of things popping up in the chat. There we go. Lovely. Okay, so this is just, sort of an invitation to you to sort of sit down with someone and hopefully use this as a way to have those discussions about how the Storywork principles can inform your culturally responsive mathematics assessment practices that you're using in your classroom. And Stephanie and I are going to share some examples from our own teaching that are an example of this. So I'm going to share an elementary sort of K-5 example. This happens to be from a grades 1 and 2 class, and it was around creating math stories. And so the two principles that I drew upon in thinking about this with Catherine as we thought about this was the principles of reverence and respect. And with young children, I think primary teachers naturally are in awe of young children. They're learning so much. They're learning to read. They're learning about themselves and who they are in their world, their identities, their mathematical problem solving and thinking is just robust and awe-inspiring. But what I wanted to do was really sort of nudge that idea of reverence. And how can I, as a teacher, take a stance about being really curious about the mathematics that is possible in a primary or K-5 classroom. And so that's an area that we wanted to think about together. And then the other principle was respect. And so as an educator, how can we collect and engage in assessment with our students that's sort of reciprocal and is respectful of the different ways that children know and share their learning? And then the second piece, again, that how can I respond to what students offer and then also nudge them forward? So this is just an example, again, from a grade 1 and 2 classroom. And we had just watched a very short video on the two-headed serpent, which is an origin story from the Musqueam. And Musqueam Language and Culture Committee community members, in collaboration with the Museum of Vancouver, created this short video clip. And then we discussed it as a class, and then students were invited to create stories inspired by that video clip. And some of the stories went in different ways, but many of the students, because we had been working on a math story project, really thought about the mathematics. And so this is one student's story creation. We provided choice in how students could create and share their story. So again, thinking about holism that Joanne just talked about as a principle connects in here as well. But that reverence and respect for the multiple senses and multiple ways of knowing and being. They could choose different materials. The student created the two-headed serpent out of clay and retold a bit of the story. In this student's story, sort of retelling, they talked about how the serpent moved through the land and each head gobbled up the same number of trees as they were moving through the land to create this space for a new river, which is being created. And so this student was doing a doubling problem as part of their math story. So one head ate 3 trees. So now how many trees had the serpent eaten altogether? And then they moved down the land and ate 3 or 4 more trees, and we're doubling that along the way. And so I was listening to this story and asking the student about the mathematics and how they were, thinking about the mental math and the doubling in their heads. And then I took that opportunity, that idea of respect, and reverence for the mathematics to nudge the students with something new to offer their thinking. And so I extended that conversation with thinking about scale and proportion and measurement, and how did they decide how big to make the serpent in relation to the setting that they had created for the story. And I sort of left them with that in terms of that nudge or that offering of the mathematics for the students to think about. So that's just one example of how sort of taking those principles and thinking about how are we engaging in mathematical conversations with students with those principles in mind. I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie for a middle school example.
Yeah, so for the middle school context, working with reciprocity and respect. So reciprocity, the guiding questions are, how can I share my experiences with others for mutual benefit? And how can I use reciprocal learning about place, community, culture, and mathematics to guide my assessment practice? And then respect, as Janice had mentioned, how can I listen and observe using my multiple senses? And how can I respond to students' thinking that both values what is offered and extends their thinking and actions? And so with my example, I want you to imagine that we enter an assessment task that is prompted by what mathematics can we learn, or what can riding the bus teach us about mathematics? And so this is a dialogue that I worked with a while back. It's informed by my previous experiences, but isn't an exact dialogue that I've had. So suppose the teacher walks into the group after getting multiple groups started and asking just what mathematics can riding the bus teach us about? And suppose a student, Kessa, says, "Hey, madam, I heard you ride the bus in the morning. On the early bus, Vic told me." And the teacher goes, "Yeah, I do. I ride the bus every morning." And Kessa says, "Yeah, that's what we were talking about." And Vic goes, "Well, that's what we started with anyway." And so the teacher now is in a position where there's a shared experience and trying to follow along with the student's thinking without feeling pressure about moving directly into the mathematics of it, as we are often pressured to do. So the teacher goes, "Oh yeah, where are you now?" And so another student in the group, Neelan, goes, "Well, after Vic said he saw you, we were all wondering if you take the same bus every day. And then we kind of got to talking about how the regular bus has the same people." And so here in blue, a teacher, that's the teacher's thinking. So a teacher might note, oh, okay, so we're sharing experiences, we're noticing some trends. So students are picking up on some patterns here. And then moving to the next one. Suppose now we've jumped forward a little bit into the conversation. And you'll notice here that all of a sudden we're talking about a map. So I don't know if you know, middle school, you may have noticed students jump around from topic to topic, they go off on tangents. And so suppose the teacher had now followed one of those tangents where students had moved from, oh, there's the same people, to, oh, there's a different amount of people at different stops. And so the teacher has now followed that sort of train of thinking and has guided the students to think about, oh, well, if you've noticed different amounts of people at different stops, how might you map that? How might you model that? And so that's the teacher using, respecting the students, what the students are offering, and also bringing in, as a facilitator, some mathematical activity. And so the teacher looks at this this particular model and thinks to themselves, nice figures. This is an opportunity to connect to continuous graphs, perhaps, but just leaving that in the mind, not pushing forward. So just thinking, that might be a good connection for later. And so the teacher goes, okay, you have a map here. Tell me about that. And in this dialogue, Kessa or Vic are asked to share. Now, the reason that I had this was before in the activity, suppose that Kessa and Vic hadn't spoken too much. And so this is sort of an inviting without pressure for those students to kind of join into the conversation. And so Vic, let's suppose Vic goes, I don't know. And he looks at the ground and he kicks his foot. So the teacher might think to themselves, what's going on here? Is he okay? Perhaps I can ask later. Kessa didn't say much earlier either. Maybe I can move to her with no pressure. It seems that Vic is showing body language that maybe not ready to share. That's okay. And so the teacher moves to Kessa, and Kessa goes, well, we drew the route and we traced from Google Maps. And at this point, a teacher might think, oh, that's really intuitive. Like, I hadn't thought to trace from Google Maps. Look, there's this technology we have available. And so the teacher may express this sort of excitement. Oh, I wouldn't have thought to trace that from Google Maps. And so here, suppose Vic grins. And that's another body language indicator. Okay, we have a grin. Maybe we'll keep observing. And so this is another diagram that was there. And the teacher, responding to this grin, goes, Vic, was that your idea? And Vic says, yeah, I do a lot of tracing and painting on my iPad at home. So now assessment is not just about the content, right? It's about informing your future teaching. And in this moment, Vic has shared an interest or an activity that he does at home. So the teacher may think, I want to know more about that. I want to connect, but I don't want to be pushy. And I want to take this interest and make a note of it for future activity, perhaps. And so the teacher may go, oh, nice. You'll have to show me some of your stuff sometime if you want. And so Vic may go, oh, yeah, junior high students may be a little bit shy, or they may be like, oh, this is kind of strange that the teacher is asking me this, but maybe showing a little bit of a grin, thinking, oh, she's interested in something more than math. And so then he may share, yeah, we traced it, and then we were running out of paper space, so we thought it might be better to put on a line. And so right here, there's actually some information on the mathematical problem solving that's going on, the adapting the model to suit the needs. And so that's a really great opportunity or moment for the teacher to make note, oh, there's some problem solving going on here. There's some critical thinking, reasoning. And suppose that note goes, yeah, but we thought it would be good to keep the landmarks. Now, this is the end of the dialogue, but there are lots of opportunities for different directions it could go from here. A teacher may inquire, what is it about the landmarks that was important for the model? And then that could get into thinking about what landmarks are around different routes. Perhaps it could get into graphing. Perhaps it could get into talking about different bus routes and how different bus routes are decided on. And there's some social justice implications in that particular route of the conversation. So this is just sort of an example of how we might start with context and follow along with the students' thinking, knowing that we can kind of make note for future assessment or also future instruction.
And just one more example. This is in the secondary context, and the two principles that connecting to here are reverence, and again, honoring students' ways of knowing and doing. So creating opportunities for students to demonstrate what they know and can do in different ways. And then that idea of reverence that I spoke about with young children, how do we instill that in the secondary classroom so that as educators and adults, we can be awed by our students' mathematical thinking and doing? And so what opportunities are we creating for students to talk about and do mathematics in different ways so that we can be awed by what they're able to share and what they're able to do? And then this idea of responsibility, how are we developing those relationships with students that focus on their mathematical thinking and honor that and share that with families, etc. So I'm going to share an example from a secondary classroom that I think also draws upon this idea of synergy. And so I collaborated with a secondary teacher around some numeracy tasks that students solved collaboratively. And this particular task that you can see in the photo was around a power outage in our community, which happens quite regularly during the stormy season. But of course, for students at this age, it's quite relevant when this happens because they can't charge their phones or other devices. And so we created a numeracy task around that and how they might make decisions about using the bars that they have left on their devices, or whether they're at school or at home, etc. So on the right, you see a photograph there of the students engaging, again, creating these opportunities for students to collaborate, do math together, and create these opportunities for listening and thinking about the students' mathematical thinking and what they can do in new ways. And I'm just going to read the teacher's reflections about assessment in his classroom. And so this was just one example. He said, for me, what matters is that students understand a concept, know how to do some algebraic procedure, or can apply a concept to solve a problem. It doesn't matter when or how they can show me that. Some students are not good at writing formal tests, and many math teachers misinterpret this as meaning that they don't understand or can't do something. However, often if you allow them to demonstrate this understanding in a different way, for example, by talking out loud during an interview or when they're working on a board with someone else, you can see that they actually do understand, especially if you ask probing questions as they work. You can also tell quite easily whether students are proficient at something by watching them work on group tasks, as in this example. Some students are just much better at expressing their thinking by talking out a problem rather than writing it in a test setting. And I think, this example really honors those ideas of choice and time and place, and learning doesn't all have to happen and be assessed at the same place and date and time. It can be assessed over time in a way that honors the students that we're working with. And so just thought that that was an example of this and some of the principles that Joanne has been sharing with us. And again, this idea of the importance of collaboration and how we can honor that in terms of assessment as well. And again, as an example for this, this leads into a conversation this teacher can then have with a family member who might come to a conference or read an ePortfolio post and say, oh, my child can do this. This is math. This counts for math. And I think by creating these openings in our classrooms, it also opens up family members and other, our colleagues and other community members to understand what mathematics is and can be within our system. So at this time, we would like to invite you, those of you, and thank you, 50 of you for staying with us this afternoon, to reflect on these examples that Stephanie and I have shared on the 7 principles from Indigenous Storywork, and share what has resonated with you in terms of making that connection from the principles to practice. And where you might get started or what you will try. And we're going to invite you, again, to share in the chat or post on the Padlet. We've got spaces on the Padlet for you to do that as well. Or if someone would like to unmute their microphone, we'd love to hear back from you in terms of what has sort of resonated and where you think you're going to get started in terms of thinking about these practices with the students that you work with.
Thank you, Janice. Or even thinking about, what might be the challenges with it, or the things that might be that you feel might make it hard to start. And sometimes just even identifying what those are can be helpful as well. It's a big question we're asking here.
We just also want to acknowledge and recognize that this is big learning that we're all doing, and we're wanting to do it together. And so hoping that we've built a bit of a community here that is interested in thinking and learning about this together, and that you'll continue to share and think together through the Padlet. But just wondering if anyone is willing to maybe share some of their thinking at this point.
So there's some Shay has uploaded an image. Let me see, a triangulation of assessment. Shay, could you say a little bit about that if you want to?
I just connected the secondary example with an image that I like, showing that we can have different balances of the 3 corners of the triangle based on it was just an image that goes well with your example. I don't know.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I haven't seen that one before. We use that triangle here, in British Columbia. It's part of our assessment framework in the province. But I really like the sort of the proportions within those 3 different triangles. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's something that I use, especially with high school teachers, when I'm making a recommendation to not rely on one type of written test as your entire assessment. Yeah.
Yeah, some good comments in the chat here. Cicely? talking about in your school, designing your report cards. You can see the opportunity to apply these concepts to all of our assessment. Yeah.
Mhm.
Cicely,
Oh, yes.
what do you see would be just, I'm thinking of extremes here. What would you see of the 7 principles? Which would you see as the maybe the most inviting to start with? And that could be either because it's more challenging, or it could be because it's the easiest. Which one of the principles do you see a connection with there?
Well, I really, of course, I can see them all, but in designing a report card that really honors the student, I think it starts for me with reverence and seeing them as these capable, just all the wonderful things that they are, and going through telling their story to the parents. So it's really it's kind of opening my mind to, well, I guess just to a different way of telling the students' story as assessment, rather than just our regular rubrics and our check boxes that we've been doing for so long.
Yeah, that's nicely said. I'm thinking about assessment as story, and having students share their stories, and then thinking about the principles of respect. How do we respect the stories that could be told in these multiple different ways, by using materials, or by oral, or by writing, or performing. There's lots of different ways that we can share that. So thank you for offering that for us to think with. Thank you. Janice, do you see any others here that you want to?
I'm just responding with little emojis to everything. My little
okay.
on the side as I'm reading through it, as I'm immersed in that.
I noticed Lindsay has a comment about incorporating journaling into math classes, where students write, record, have a conversation. But the last challenge, or you mentioned, Lindsay, a challenge from students and colleagues, and they say that this isn't real, as quote, real assessment, unquote. Would you like to say a little more about that? I think that's intriguing.
Sorry, I'm not going to turn my camera on. I'm fighting a cold right now and zooming in from my house. I teach at the senior level, and even with the students, they're flabbergasted at the idea that they don't have to do tests. That's the only way they're used to showing their learning, and how they, in the situation I work in, a lot of them say, I can't do math. So it's been very interesting. It has changed in the last few years, I think, as different methods are being used at the elementary and middle school. It's starting, I guess you could say, bleed into the high school level, and the students, there's not as much pushback, but there definitely was the first couple of years where I get a lot of looks and just a lot of comments, like it's just not what people are used to, but it definitely is changing.
Thank you for sharing that. I know, I don't know if you're listening, Mike Wong, if you would want to share a little bit about the circular assessment that your colleagues have developed in the Burnaby School District.
I can. I know you told me that I might be talking, but I did not prepare the document to pull up. Do you have it there, Cynthia?
Oh, do I have it there? I think I do.
So a couple of teachers in Burnaby have been working on trying to figure out how to sort of incorporate a circular rubric, something that uses sort of the principles of the medicine wheel as opposed to just simply a linear scale, which I think for a lot of educators just sort of means that even if you've made the transition to a proficiency scale where you've recognized that growth is what's important, what we also want to reiterate is that at different times in your learning, you cycle back to sort of an emerging or a developing phase. And that sort of happens every time that students learn something new. And the hard part for a lot of students, I think, and teachers is that they do sort of have this linear sort of view of assessment and education, where you're just going to keep adding and you're always going to get better. As opposed to, we all know that, like in real life, whenever we learn something new for the first time, we start again at the beginning. And that requires us to sort of be vulnerable and to make mistakes and to work our way through again. And as we practice and get better, we continue to grow. And that cycle is sort of continuously happening over and over and over again. I'm just going to see if I can find it too here.
Yeah, I have it, but
okay.
I'd have to stop sharing and reshare. Would it be okay to put it on the Padlet as a resource?
Yeah, I can do that. I can find it and put it up on the Padlet here.
Because it is a visual. It would perfect. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Cynthia, we have someone with a raised hand. Sheila.
Hi there.
Hey, nice to see you.
My hand here so that I don't confuse people. Yeah, I'd love to have a thank you so much for this beautiful, rich, and very important work that we're undergoing and undertaking together as we journey together. This is such a wonderful gathering to have, and I'm so proud and pleased to be with so many like-minded folks who are nourished by our practice and want to continue nourishing our students by the best practice. And so I wanted to respond to the comments about, there was one comment here about pushback with respect to non-traditional assessment, the non-traditional paper pen assessment, or some of the vertical non-permanent surface learning feedback. As somebody who's gone through graduate school, I can tell you very much that this kind of feedback, when you're in an open seminar, and you're sharing what you know, and you're sharing what you've learned in your research that you've done, and you're doing a lab meeting or you're doing an informal presentation, you're absolutely up there doing equations on the board. You're absolutely up there sharing in a vertical non-permanent basis, and you're being assessed and you're being questioned and critiqued by your colleagues, by your peers, by your colleagues in the lab, by your examiners, by your principal investigator. So that is an absolutely robust way of assessing student knowledge, kind of on the fly. And it's definitely done in professional circles. It's definitely done in postgraduate. And as is journaling as a form of assessment, one wouldn't necessarily look at it and assess it on a scale of 1 to 10, one being 10. But this becomes an opportunity when you have students journaling. They're beginning to form that sense of self, and they're beginning to see themselves as learners and not just recipients of all of the stuff that we're up there throwing at them. They're starting to look at their own development as a young novice learner moving into a more mature learner, and they can trace back on where they were and where they are now and where they need to get to. They're so used to us saying, this is what you need to do and this is where you need to get to. And when they begin to become that self-aware, it's so rich for them and it's so empowering for them. And I've started to do this. And I mean, I've been doing this for about 20 years now. And I was originally going, I don't know, like I could be teaching them how to factor, but no, I'm going to get them to do some journaling here. And the effect has been very good on my students. And, some of them are just not going to buy into it and they want to do their thing. And that's fine. They can do that if they're feeling that self-aware and they already know where they are. And they tend to often be very much on the higher end. And they're going, well, why do I have to talk about my learning in math? I'm already getting, I'm proficient. Great. And when I've started to assess kids in that non-traditional pen and paper way, the assessment isn't just in the box that I've drawn. It's gone off at all these different tangents that you really can get an idea of where your kids are struggling, because it's a very much a moving and living process between the two of you. And so you can have their proficiencies, where they're struggling, and then you can ask them a question, and then all of a sudden they'll take you in this direction that you never thought they knew. You never saw that they had seen it from that angle. And it's become such a wonderful discourse between them. I mean, I've had assessments that I thought were going to take 10 minutes turn into a half an hour thing because it was so rich. So yeah, I would like to say I'm very much looking forward to doing a lot more experimentation with that, and the sharing of story and the talking of story. It's such an important process that we have lost and we need to recapture. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. Lots there, Sheila. We hope we hear more from your experimenting and sharing about what you're learning there. especially in thinking about communicating that with families and parents and communities, this reciprocity to the community and to the family. So, and even thinking about how the family is, what students know is being brought into the classroom, so that reciprocal nature back and forth. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else have maybe one final comment before we're getting to our time to wrap up? Jess, you have a long good one here.
Yeah, I'd like to hear Jess, because I am working with some of the fellow teachers that I think you were working with also.
Hi.
Okay.
So Janice knows this group as well because they are connected with the BC Regio group, and they're really quite an amazing group of teachers. And so last year we read Indigenous Storywork, and they've been moving. They're really quite masterful at working with outdoor learning and provocations and Regio inspired learning. And so Cheryl and Allison, who are our Indigenous helping teachers in Surrey, they had a friend of ours that we all used to work with, Julia Thompson, who lives over on the island now. She made these mats, handmade, of the Stolo area, like out by Mount Cheam, and also the Semiahmoo in the bay there down in White Rock area. And so she made 10 mats that we bought, and 4 of them went to teacher librarians to try out in their learning commons. But the other 6, I had gotten some funding for the group, and we bought 6 of the mats, and they have been using them in their classrooms. They're set up in their classrooms for the kids to use. And sorry, my children are just being noisy. I'm just going to close the door. And so they had originally, Julia had included some pieces with the mats, like for the Mount Cheam group, it's based on one of the stories, the mountain goat story from the Stolo Satel stories, and that you're working with to revitalize, I think, Joanne. And so there's like little mountain goats, and the mountains are hollow because the people in the story live inside the mountains. And so it's been really interesting watching how the kids interact with the mats, because they're kind of doing it through the lens of Indigenous story work, and also the kids are familiar with like learning stories and that kind of inquiry-based approach. And so the interesting thing is how you can really see like how their sort of schemas for their cultures and their understanding of things gets layered over top of the like these indigenous places with these indigenous stories. Like they keep wanting to set up tables. Like every time they keep building tables to put in there, and they added like a barn for the mountain goats and stuff. And so it's really interesting, like just like I haven't had a chance to work with the kids one-on-one, but listening to the teachers tell the stories of how, they ask them the questions like, what would you need tables for in this context, right? And yeah, I mean, we're just kind of in the middle of it right now, but it's just a really interesting approach to not having everything siloed. Like I keep going in and being like, okay, everybody, like the funding came from the math department. So let's make sure that we have where's the math? And can you make sure that I need some examples of your math provocations and make sure their learning stories are like math. And they're like, the math is there, Jess. The math is there. But the holistic nature of the learning, and therefore the holistic nature of the learning story, is just, even for somebody like me that was like my early education was Waldorf and stuff like that. So I'm not used to this kind of unitizing and siloing of everything anyway.
But Jess, you've given us a whole bunch to think about there. Thank you very, very much. Yeah. But I mean, in terms of thinking about the story and the connection and the holism that is needed for thinking about this, as well as trying to think about how do we enact some of these principles through, like you're talking about the placemats, and then how the tables in relationship to that. So I think that I hope that we hear more from you, just as I said to Sheila, by posting some responses in the Padlet as you're learning through this along the way. But I noticed that it's also time for us to wrap up. So I just wanted to maybe just go to our last slide, which is the slide we began with. And just again, thank everybody for attending. I think we have some new people here compared to our sessions 1 and 2. So thank you very much for those who are new to our session. And thank you for those who have returned all 3 times, or even if this is just your second time, thank you for that. And we hope that you take away some examples of thinking about culturally responsive math assessment guided by the principles of Indigenous Storywork that help us think about math assessment that values more than just individual success, but also collaboration. It contributes to family and community thriving. It supports and nurtures trusting relationships and creates these conditions that benefit all of us, thinking about human and other than human. So thank you, everybody, for the rich conversation and the ideas for this. We hope that our learning together continues through the Padlet, and we hope we will offer another series related to math education. Last year, we offered a series which you'll find the videos on the Padlet. Oh, I think I have the Padlet right here. Yeah, look at this. I have the Padlet here. So you can go to the Padlet and you can be able to see over here on the far side some of the videos that we offered last year on sessions on Indigenous Storywork, on place, social justice. And then we also offered our first thinking about culturally responsive math assessment. So post your ideas. Let's continue to think together, just as our invitations with Lady Laus and Kagan Jad invite us to engage in this kind of more holistic way of thinking about interrelatedness and synergy and holism. And we hope that we continue together. Oh, Janice also put a link in the chat around the Indigenous Math Symposium. So please keep your eyes open for that. We'll be sending the poster and invitation for that very soon. So thank you, everybody. And yeah, please fill out the poll that gives us a little bit of feedback there. And I think the Lando Institute, I want to thank them as well, and Kelvin for helping us. We'll be sending out a short survey on the series as well. So thank you, everybody, and thanks for joining. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Joanne. Thanks, Janice. And thank you, Stephanie.
Did you mean Cynthia Leyton?
Yeah.
What did I say?
Sylvia.
Oh.
Thank you.
But that's okay.
Also, thank you to Cynthia Nicol. Thanks, everybody. I said Sylvia?
Great questions in the chat. So it's we'll have to save those.